You made a decision today, probably a dozen of them before you even left the house. What to eat, what to wear, whether to hit snooze one more time or drag yourself vertical. And every single one of those decisions, every single one, was shaped by something you almost certainly weren't thinking about consciously. Not habit, not instinct, not personality. Something more structural than any of those. Something that was quietly steering your choices before you ever opened your eyes. You've been responding to this mechanic your entire life. It shaped what career you pursued, where you chose to live, what you had for lunch, and whether you're watching this video right now instead of doing something else. And the wild part is, it's not hidden. It's not a secret. It's operating right out in the open. You just never had the framework to see it clearly. Today, we give it a name. An incentive is anything that changes the cost or benefit of a decision. That's it. If something makes a choice more attractive, that's a positive incentive. If something makes a choice more painful, more expensive, or more risky, that's a negative incentive. Every decision you make sits inside a web of these nudges. Some obvious, some buried so deep in the structure of your environment that you'd never notice them unless someone pointed them out. Economics doesn't assume people are greedy. It doesn't assume people are rational. It assumes something much simpler and much harder to argue with. People respond to incentives. Change the incentives, change the behavior. Let's start with the cleanest version of this. A coffee shop sells a medium coffee for $4. They introduce a loyalty card. Buy 9, get the 10th free. What just happened? The price of coffee didn't change. The quality didn't change. The location didn't change. But the incentive structure shifted. Now, buying your coffee at this specific shop carries an additional future benefit that buying it anywhere else does not. And that's enough. That's enough to change where thousands of people buy their morning coffee. Not because they did a spreadsheet, not because they consciously calculated the 10% discount, because the incentive tilted the playing field just enough to redirect behavior at scale. This is the tutorial level. One incentive, one behavioral shift, clean cause and effect. You see the same mechanic in employee bonuses tied to quarterly targets, in tax deductions for homeownership, in airline miles programs that reward loyalty with upgrades. In every case, someone designed an incentive to make one choice more attractive than the alternatives, and in every case, behavior shifted accordingly. Simple enough, but the real world is not this tidy. Here's where the difficulty scales. Incentives almost never operate alone. They stack, they conflict, and they create second-order effects that nobody drew up on a whiteboard. Take something that sounds straightforward. A city wants fewer cars on the road during rush hour, so they introduce congestion pricing. Drive into the downtown core between 7 and 9 a.m., pay an extra $8. The intended incentive is clear. Make driving more expensive during peak hours, push people toward transit, reduce traffic, and it works. Traffic drops. But here's what happens next. Businesses near the boundary of the congestion zone, just outside the pricing perimeter, suddenly see increased traffic as drivers reroute to avoid the fee. Property values shift. Delivery companies adjust their schedules, which changes when goods arrive at stores, which changes staffing patterns. Some workers who can't afford the fee and don't have good transit options now face longer commutes on alternate routes. One incentive applied to one behavior ripples outward into housing markets, labor patterns, logistics chains, and retail economics. None of these secondary effects are mistakes. They're not signs the policy failed. They're what happens when you change one variable inside a system where everything is connected. This is the first upgrade to your mental model. Incentives don't just change the targeted behavior. They change every behavior that touches the targeted behavior. The ripple effect is not a bug. It's how incentive systems actually work. Now add another layer. People don't just respond to incentives. They adapt to them, game them, and find creative workarounds that the incentive designer never anticipated. Economists call this moral hazard, adverse selection, or the principal agent problem depending on the specific flavor, but the underlying mechanic is always the same. When you change the rules, people change their strategy. Consider car insurance. The incentive structure seems straightforward. You pay a premium, the insurer covers your losses if something goes wrong. But the moment you have insurance, your relationship with risk subtly shifts. You might park in a slightly sketchier spot. You might delay that brake repair by another month. Not because you're irresponsible, because the cost-benefit calculation changed. The downside of a fender bender is now partially absorbed by someone else, which means the incentive to avoid one got a little weaker. Insurance companies know this, which is why deductibles exist. They're a counter-incentive designed to keep some skin in the game. And why your premium goes up after a claim, another counter-incentive, restoring some of the original cost structure that the insurance itself eroded. What you're watching is an incentive arms race. One party creates an incentive structure. The other party adapts their behavior to optimize within it. The first party adjusts. The cycle continues. This is happening everywhere, all the time, in tax codes, in employment contracts, in how streaming platforms design their recommendation algorithms. Every system that tries to shape behavior creates a new landscape for people to navigate, and people are remarkably good at navigating. This brings us to the thing about incentives that most explanations leave out, and it's the piece that separates knowing the definition from actually understanding the mechanic. Incentives are not just financial. They're not even primarily financial. Every decision you make sits at the intersection of at least three types of incentives: economic, social, and moral, and they frequently pull in different directions. Here's what that looks like. Imagine you find a wallet on the ground with $300 in it and a driver's license. The economic incentive is unambiguous. Keep the money, you're $300 richer and nobody will ever know. But the social incentive pushes back. If someone saw you pocket it, your reputation takes a hit. And the moral incentive pushes harder still. Most people feel genuine discomfort at the idea of keeping someone else's lost money, regardless of whether anyone is watching. What you actually do in that moment isn't determined by any single incentive. It's determined by the relative weight of all three, and that weight varies by person, by culture, by context, and even by mood. This is why purely economic models of behavior break down so often. They're optimizing for one stat while ignoring two others that are just as real. The economist who only sees financial incentives is like a player who maxed out one attribute and neglected the rest of the skill tree. Technically specialized, functionally incomplete. Real behavior is multi-stat, always. This also explains one of the most common policy failures in history: incentive structures that get the financial math right and the social or moral dimension completely wrong. In the 1990s, a series of daycare centers in Israel started finding parents who picked up their children late. Logical financial incentive. Make lateness cost money. Get less lateness. What actually happened? Late pickups increased. The fine turned a moral obligation, I shouldn't make the teachers stay late, into a market transaction. I'm paying for extra time. Parents who previously felt guilty about being late now felt they had purchased the right to be. The incentive worked exactly as designed on the economic axis. It just demolished the moral incentive that had been doing most of the heavy lifting, and the net result was worse behavior, not better. This isn't an edge case. This is what happens when you treat incentives as a single-dimension lever instead of a multi-axis system. Understanding this is the difference between reading a tooltip and actually knowing how the mechanic works at a fundamental level. So what does all of this change for you? It changes what you see when you look at the world. Once you understand incentives, really understand them, not just the textbook definition, but the stacking, the adaptation, the multidimensional tension, you start reading systems differently. When a company announces a new policy, you stop asking what it's supposed to do and start asking what behavior it actually rewards. When a government introduces a new regulation, you look past the press release and trace the incentive chain. Who benefits? Who adapts? Where do the ripples land? And what existing incentive structures does it collide with? When someone does something that seems irrational, you stop assuming they're stupid and start looking for the incentive you haven't identified yet. You stop judging the player and start examining the rules of the game they're playing. Because here's the foundational insight. Behavior that looks irrational almost always makes perfect sense once you see the full incentive map. People aren't random. They're responsive. And if you can read what they're responding to, you can understand almost anything they do. If this episode made something click, if incentives went from a word you've heard to a lens you can actually use, this is exactly what 8-bit economics is built for. This is the second episode in a 5-part series designed to give you the foundational mechanics that make everything else in economics make sense. Subscribe if you want the full build. Hit like if this one leveled up how you think about decisions. And drop a comment with whatever you want to understand next. I read everyone. Every complex system runs on simple mechanics. Now you know one more. Here's the thing worth sitting with. You are surrounded by incentive structures you didn't design and didn't agree to. Your employer designed one. Your bank designed one. Your city designed one. The platform you're watching this on designed one. And it's very good at what it does. None of them are neutral, and none of them exist by accident. Every one of them was built to make certain choices easier and other choices harder, and they're running in the background of your life whether you notice them or not. The question was never whether incentives shape your behavior. They do. They always have. The question is whether you can see them clearly enough to make choices that are actually yours. That's not a guarantee, but it's a start.